This is a new segment I'm working on in order to upload videos, hopefully weekly. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'm still working on Creepify True or False, but the animations take me a pretty long time to do, so here's a new segment I'm calling Creepify Mysteries. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds of pages on this particular case. Some articles offer varying statements, but this episode is an amalgamation of the research I've found, some of which comes from actual police and FBI records and correspondence. I should note this case is a bit graphic, but I tried to tone down some of the gruesome parts. It's still a very sinister and disturbing one, so let's dive into the Phantom Killer of Texarkana. Two lovers are making out in their car when an urgent bulletin is broadcasted about an escaped mental patient in the vicinity. They hear a noise. The young man investigates, and his girlfriend soon hears scratching above her head. It's her boyfriend's body slain by a lunatic with a hook. His feet scrape against the roof overhead as he hangs above the vehicle. It's a fable tale with many versions, but its roots are planted in truth. The Phantom Killer of Texarkana terrorized the Ark-La-Tex region in the 1940s and inspired the film The Town That Dreaded Sundown. The press contrived the phrase, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, after the slew of grisly crimes that shook the Twin Cities in Texas and Arkansas to its core. For 2.5 months, residents were petrified. Men and women were afraid to leave their homes at night. Some were even too afraid to work. The Federal Bureau of Investigation eventually joined in search of the maniac who committed unspeakable acts, but their efforts would prove fruitless. Though the true killer didn't have a hook for a hand, one disturbing quality is that he wore a cloth bag over his head with 2 cutout eye holes, inspiring his nickname. The initial incident took place on February 22, 1946. 19-year-old Mary Jean LeRae and her boyfriend, 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis, saw a movie together and hadn't the faintest idea what would come next. Though they weren't too far from the homes where townspeople lay sleeping, their soon-to-be attack would go unimpeded. One can assume they were doing just what young lovers do, kissing, talking about the future, asking questions about the other, each taking in the other's moonlit form and enjoying their time together. But seemingly out of nowhere, an assailant materialized and shined a flashlight into the driver's side door, where Jimmy was sitting. Now, it's pretty easy to hear about this happening and think, whoa, that's creepy. But take a moment just to put yourself in their shoes and imagine how terrifying it is to feel like your life is at risk. It's unimaginable if you haven't been threatened by somebody wishing to do you harm before. Struck by fear, Hollis told the masked man that he had the wrong guy. Perhaps the young man didn't realize that he and his girlfriend were the intended targets. Maybe he thought the man was just a cop, but the attacker just coldly responded, quote, "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say." Afraid for his life and endangered by the will of the threatening man, Jimmy complied. Besides, he had every inclination to believe if he did as commanded, he'd be spared. Gun in hand, the masked man ordered him to take off his clothes, so Jimmy complied. Mary Jean then heard what she thought was a gunshot, but it was actually Jimmy's skull fracturing. The miscreant hit Jimmy Hollis so hard with the gun handle that his cranial bones split. He crumbled to the ground, leaving the malefactor's sights set on Mary Jean, who was still unharmed but not for long. She hadn't yet comprehended the full magnitude of the situation. She tried to show she had no money, thinking the man wanted cash. He then struck her and commanded her to run. When she started towards a ditch, he ordered her up the road, seemingly excited for the prospect of a chase, and the young girl obliged, hoping for an opportunity to escape. Mary Jean found a morsel of hope when she happened upon a parked car, but that spark of hope quickly faded when she realized it was empty. She was helpless. The man pursuing her used this as an opportunity to accost her further. He asked her what she was doing, to which she replied, "You told me to run." Maybe he was too deranged to remember, but he was most likely playing mind games. After the maniacal man further attacked her, Mary Jean told the man to just kill her, at which he grew bored and fled. It's worth noting that in another account, a passing motorist happened upon the scene and frightened LeRae's pursuer away. Both versions agree that Mary ran as fast as her legs would carry her to a house nearby, half a mile away, and the homeowners called the police for her. Around that time, her boyfriend, surviving the blows to his head, enlisted the aid of a passerby to call authorities. Surely, during their time apart, neither Lorraine nor Hollis could ascertain the condition of the other, but they both survived and were reunited, although their night's events undoubtedly and indelibly emblazoned in their minds. After the attack, Jimmy Hollis stated, quote, "I know he's crazy. The crazy things he said made me feel that his mind was warped," end quote. Hollis also eerily prophesied that the unknown subject would kill his next victim, and Jimmy was right. Neither Mary Jean nor Jimmy could be sure of any distinguishing features of the man who held them captive. Because of the blinding flashlight, they couldn't discern the slightest identifying facial factors like unusual markings, eye color, or complexion. However, they both agreed the man was tall, at least 6 feet, which surely increased the terror he inflicted. Police suspected Mary knew more than she let on, covering for the man who committed felonious acts that fateful night. The next couple to meet a similar fate weren't as lucky to keep their lives. 29-year-old Richard L. Griffin and his 17-year-old girlfriend Polly Ann Moore had only been dating about 6 weeks on March 24th, a little over a month from the first onslaught. Griffin and Moore were last seen enjoying a meal together the night before. Less than 12 hours later, they were dead. A passerby had initially thought the occupants of the car to be sleeping in an odd position, but later realized the situation was much more sinister. Because neither could live to tell their story, one can only speculate on any words exchanged between parties. It rained the preceding night, so any fingerprints were washed away. But police found 1 bullet and 2 cartridge casings, leading authorities to infer that the suspect had used a .32 revolver. Each was shot once in the head. There was a good amount of blood a few yards away from the vehicle. Officials assumed they were shot outside and placed inside the back seat of the car. An opposing report says that Polly was discovered laying down in the back seat, and Richard was lifelessly kneeling over the dash up front. The latter inference would align more with the suspect's MO. The event was most likely quick. It didn't appear there was evidence indicating the couple had been more than 20 feet from where they were discovered. Faint drag marks led from the stains of blood outside to the bodies in the car. After the first official murders, Mary Jean LeRae returned from her new home in Oklahoma to Texarkana to continue to help aid police. She had fled the sleepy town to put more space and time between herself and the hell she endured. She suspected the masked man who brutalized her and her boyfriend in the weeks before being responsible and wanted to save any more would-be victims from the same fate. But still, Texas Rangers suspected that Lorraine knew more than she was letting on and was protecting the killer. Nearly 200 suspects in this new incident were questioned, but none were indicted on charges. There were promising leads when 3 people with bloody clothes were brought in, but all were cleared. Police offered a $500 reward at the end of March, equaling over $10,000 in current currency. It only furnished false leads and wasted police's time. After Richard L. Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were killed, the award was more than tripled to $1,700, equaling over $34,000 in current currency. The next incident was just 3 weeks later on April 15, 1946, at around 1 o'clock in the morning. 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker had just finished performing saxophone in the orchestra at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Club on 4th and Oak Street for a dance. 17-year-old Paul Martin, her friend since kindergarten, picked her up. Paul had come to town to visit high school friends and see his friend Betty Jo over the weekend. He arrived from Kilgore, Texas just days before. The two were last seen in the early morning hours, leaving in Paul's car. Betty Jo was a popular girl, well-liked by her peers and schoolmates. Associates of Paul's described him as an amiable kid with no known rivals. He was the first to be found, discovered by J.H. Weaver and his family as they drove down North Park Road. He was laying on his side covered in blood about a mile away from his parked car, which still was with the key in its ignition. Police located a latent fingerprint on the steering wheel, which did not belong to Paul or Betty Jo. After scrutinizing the boy's body, the medical examiner concluded that Paul put up a hellacious fight before succumbing to the 4 bullet wounds that took his life. A search party set out to look for Betty Jo hours later, Palm Sunday of 46, at 11 o'clock a.m. They unfortunately found her. She was located approximately 3 miles away from Paul's body and over 1.5 miles away from his parked car, which did have a noticeable amount of blood inside. There were also a handful of .32 caliber Colt pistol shell casings found. In addition to the evidence, Betty Jo's saxophone was missing from her car. She was posed and seated against a tree with her hand in her coat pocket and a bullet through her face and one through her heart. There was male DNA found on her, but it wasn't of use to authorities at that time, predating the discovery of DNA in the 80s. A newspaper article about the murder said she gave, quote, mute evidence of a struggle, end quote, meaning, like Paul, she fought with every bit of might within her to survive until she no longer did. Law enforcement couldn't discern who had perished first. Betty Jo's mother had assumed she had been safely driven home that calamitous night after the dance and had no idea she was missing until it was time to wake her daughter for Sunday school. Some reports state that the two were a couple and some say they were simply close friends. It's hard to say which is true, but they possibly had been seeing each other and neither friends nor family were aware. After the killer had amassed his fourth victims, he officially became known as the Phantom Killer. Townspeople were baffled by the loss of the young victims, slain under the hand of such a ruthless perpetrator. Texas Ranger and lead official on the case, Manuel Terrorized Gonzalez, now enlisted the help of teenagers to coax out the Moonlight Murderer, while armed police officers hid in trees, ready to make a move. Perhaps he was aware of the plan because all intentional efforts to draw out the killer proved fruitless, and crimes continued unabated. After the second murder, officials brought in suspects within a 100-mile radius of the slain couple's location. Police also gave a detailed description of Betty Jo's missing saxophone and told them to alert the police if an instrument matching its characteristics was found in a music or pawn shop. The sax was eventually found months later with no clues to the identity of the person who placed it there. After the Booker Martin case, investigators discovered a hat wind cord, which they believed to have been in possession of the killer before it was lost. Police worked feverishly to discover the manufacturer of this evidence, as clues in the killings were slim to none. And the more time went on, the more perilous the overall mood of the town became. Because the events took place so many years ago, forensics were not as advanced as they are today, and DNA was undiscovered, although they could have discerned blood type. Detectives visually inspected fingerprints. With a latent print on Paul Merton's steering wheel, Glenn H. McLaughlin, the chief of the Bureau of Identification and Records, sent photocopies of the prints to the director of the FBI, Edgar Hoover, but still no suspect could be apprehended. In February of 1950, a letter was sent to the director of the FBI stating that 88 suspects were located and compared to the latent prints, but none proved to match. The Arkansas State Police, the Texas Rangers, and the FBI joined in the search for a killer after this case had become the biggest investigation in recent Texas history. After another semi-short cooling-off period, the Phantom struck again on May 3rd. 37-year-old Virgil Starks and his wife, 36-year-old Katie, were at their 500-acre home about 10 miles away from Texarkana, blissfully unaware of the threat outside their home. Virgil was resting on his chair and listening to the radio in the living room when two bullets came racing through his closed window, hitting him in the back of the head. He was dead in an instant. Katie Starks, after hearing the noise and rushing quickly to get the phone, was also shot 2 times by the murderer, who hadn't moved since he killed her husband. She was in serious condition and a massive amount of pain for some time, but did survive. Still trailed by the killer, Katie rushed out of the house without shoes or socks to a neighbor's house and cried that her husband was dead. And with the bullet wounds still fresh in her face, she collapsed to the ground. She was the only victim to be shot by the Phantom Killer and lived to tell about it. Miller County Sheriff W.E. Davis became the lead investigator on the Starks case and spoke at length with Katie Starks. She wasn't able to lead law enforcement to capture the criminal responsible, but she was able to correct a rumor that her husband Virgil had heard a suspicious car outside their home for several nights before he was shot. Unfortunately, Katie Starks hadn't gotten a good look at the intruder. He'd been covered by the shroud of darkness. Cops amassed a plethora of findings from Virgil and Katie Stark's house, including shoe prints from the intruder, a tire track indentation consistent with other tire track marks at other victims of the Phantom Killer, a film pack of latent prints, a flashlight, blood samples, and more bullet casings and cartridges, which were collected by Dallas Field Officer Presley and Special Agent Horace S. Hallett of the Little Rock Field Office. The evidence was cataloged and sent in to be examined. The typo blood all mostly belonged to Virgil Starks. The shoe print was ascertained to be a 9.5 to a 10.5 size left shoe print, most likely belonging to the killer. The shoe was, quote, not worn much before, end quote, with no identifying marks found. The tire tread impression was, quote, similar in style and design to Allstate passenger car tire, end quote. Cartridge casings were marked as being indicative of a Colt Woodsman pistol. There were no latent impressions of value developed on the flashlight dropped by the killer or the back of the chair that Virgil Starks was sitting on. Even after the evidence was examined, still no suspects were in prison. And because a different weapon was used at this time, authorities were reluctant to link Virgil Starks' death to the former crimes. In 1948, it was regarded as a different case from the former 3 nightmarish incidents, but most consider them linked today. Increased police presence in Lover's Lanes may have compelled the Phantom to strike in a place where no one expected him, and he did just that. But if this was the work of the sinister madman, that meant that it wasn't only young couples parked on the sides of the road or walking home at night who were in danger. It meant everyone was at risk. Men found driving in the area, along with others spotted on the night of the 4th attack, were detained, but again to no avail. And 10 days after Virgil Starks' murder, the reward money again rose to $10,000, equaling over $203,000 in today's American currency. Local media covered the Texarkana moonlight murders around the clock, and the presence of law enforcement increased exorbitantly. Everyone was convinced, in part because of local coverage, that the Phantom of the Ark-La-Tex region could strike any person at any time, and this meant not a single person was safe. A newspaper article pulled from the FBI archives reads, quote, Texarkana killer strikes again. 6th victim found. Arkansas, May 7th. The mangled up body of a man was found sprawled on the tracks of the Kansas City and Southern Railroad, 14 miles north of here today, leading harassed police to believe a cold-blooded phantom killer has claimed his 6th victim. State and county officers were led to the man's body as they worked feverishly to clear up the mystery of the 2 double slayings and a 3rd attempted double murder that had terrorized the Texarkana area for the past 6 weeks. Body moved after death. Authorities suspected murder in the latest death when a coroner's verdict determined the man was dead before his body was placed across the rails. He was identified as Earl Cliff McSpadden from his social security card, end quote. Now, this was just days after the previous attack on the Starks, which doesn't adhere to the cooling off period that the masked assailant had abided by. Initially ruled as suicide, the medical examiner discovered that Earl Cliff McSpadden was deceased before the train hit him. There's not a ton of information available about the unfortunate man whose death remains a mystery as of now, but some members of the town even speculated that the mystery man on the tracks had been the Phantom Killer himself, unable to live with his guilt. But judging from the ruthless, unhinged assaults, it was pretty clear that he was devoid of the smallest morsel of compassion or empathy. Others considered that McSpadden was another victim of the Moonlight Murderer, as an unplanned attack that didn't pan out as expected. On May 11th, police publicly connected the events between the attacks on the initial victims, Mary Jean LeRae and her boyfriend Jimmy Hollis. Mary Jean gave an interview to the Texarkana Gazette one day prior, perhaps inspiring local officials to do so. They urged all members of the Texarkana area to report any strange or unexplainable absences of friends, family members, and/or acquaintances. Residents assembled crude homemade alarm systems of pots and pans tied to strings and rigged to make noise upon invasion. People bought dogs to increase their feelings of security, but still, fear permeated throughout Texarkana. Though this next case took place in another location, it's still eerily similar to the killings in the South Central region. The unsolved murders of 21-year-old Lawrence Hogan and his 24-year-old girlfriend Elaine Eldridge occurred on October 9, 1946, a Wednesday, on the southeastern coast of Florida near Fort Lauderdale. The late spring of 1946 was the last time any official had ruled the slayings as belonging to the infamous Phantom. He appeared to have vanished into thin air, physically unnoticed by the terrified town, but etched into the mind of all those left alive. Like several other victims, Elaine had been shot several times in the face and died near the car outside of it. Lawrence had been shot in the chest. Sheriff Walter Clark, the head of the investigation, was contacted by the Texas Director of Public Safety, Homer Garrison Jr., concerning the attack and questioning if the killer from the former attacks could have migrated to Florida to terrorize a new town. Of course, anything would be possible, especially in a case like this. The investigation discovered that the bullets used in the crime were inconsistent with the first 3 Phantom attacks and may be a different culprit. But because no one has ever answered for the crimes of the Moonlight murders, it is difficult to believe the Phantom killer quit his escapades cold turkey. He most likely was jailed for an unrelated crime, died, or continued killing in a different area, eluding capture altogether. Over 400 suspects were looked at for these heinous slayings. The unknown man assailed, yet no one was ever put in jail permanently to answer for his crimes. There were too many suspects to talk about in this video, but here are some of the most notable. Ewell and Peggy Swinney. Many authorities considered Ewell Lee Swinney to be the major suspect in the Moonlight murders. He was born on February 9th, 1917 in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, ironically the son of a minister. The initial attacks on Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean LeRae took place just 13 days after Swinney's 29th birthdays. A repeat offender, Swinney's charges included car theft, counterfeiting, burglary, and assault. Though he was given a life sentence after being convicted of stealing a car, he was released from prison 27 years later. His wife Peggy Swinney gave a detailed description of Ewell in the Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin case, leading to his arrest, but she later refused to testify against him in court, and she legally was not obligated to. Ewell also refused to be given a polygraph exam, which isn't a crime in itself, but is worth noting. A letter from police records details that law enforcement conducted a search of the Swinney home and found a, quote, shirt with a laundry mark having the name of Starks, end quote. Ewell's being a car thief is interesting because Officer Max Tackett discovered a car was reported stolen before each of the Phantom crimes took place. It does make sense the assailant wouldn't want to use his car if he had one for fear of being identified. Peggy Swinney was found getting into a car reported stolen shortly before the murder of Virgil Starks, leading law enforcement to her husband. Peggy even claimed during an interview that although she hadn't taken part in any of the attacks, she did witness the murders of Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin. She detailed her husband driving 200 feet past their parked car on a lover's lane after midnight. They had abducted the teenagers and forced them into their car, a stolen Plymouth, and drove about a quarter of a mile, where Ewell forced Paul Martin out and shot him twice after the boy climbed a fence. They continued with Betty Jo in the car when Ewell noticed Paul staggering around, still alive, and shot him twice more. Ewell later forced his wife out of the car to be alone with Betty Jo for approximately a half hour. Upon Peggy's return, Ewell made Betty Jo exit the car and walked her out to a wooded area, and Peggy heard 2 shots. Ewell changed his clothes because they had blood on them. The following quote is directly from the FBI archives. Quote, "It is to be pointed out that at the place designated by Mrs. Swinney as to where the clothes were changed is the same point where the Martin boy's address book was found. After changing his clothes, they drove back down the road to where the Martin boy's car was parked, and Swinney got a black case from the back seat of the Martin boy's car and put it in the back of his car." End quote. Ewell was alleged to have later burnt his bloody clothes. He told his wife the first gun used in the double murder of Richard L. Griffin and Polly Ann Moore was the same one used in the double murder of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. Police also stated the stolen Plymouth authorities had discovered had 2 Allstate tires. If you remember from the Starks attack, the tire impressions discovered was noted as most likely having an Allstate tire. Unfortunately for the investigation, Peggy Swinney had difficulty keeping her story straight. In a letter meant for her parents that police intercepted, she admitted she lied during her confession and expressed guilt about the prospect of sending her husband to, quote, the chair. It could have been a ploy to confuse law enforcement, though. On July 28th, she told officers she had only admitted guilt because of such extensive questioning by the authorities, and said the complete confession she'd given had been untrue. Peggy Lois Swinney's prints were also taken and compared to the print from the Booker Martin double murder and found not to be a match. Officers Max Tackett and Tillman Johnson wholeheartedly believed until their deaths that Ewell Swinney was the Phantom Killer of Texarkana, along with many others who believed the crazed murderer died a peaceful death in a nursing home in 1994, although Ewell did spend the rest of his life in and out of prison. Even after Ewell's capture, Ranger Gonzalez continued his search for the identity of the true killer, and despite evident sheer influence, in the end Ewell Swinney's prints didn't match, and Swinney himself denied being the Phantom. An unknown hitchhiker in Kilgore, Texas on the night of May 7th, I think 1946 as well, a hitchhiker armed with a pistol carjacked a man, threatening to kill him as he did in the Booker murder case. He stated that he was not done killing and immediately and threateningly demanded the car be surrendered to him. The lawmen who worked on the case, as well as I, are reluctant to think this man had anything to do with the Moonlight murders. The Phantom Killer was elusive and expertly concealed his identity. If he had revealed his true identity to anyone, they most likely wouldn't have lived to tell about it. Henry Booker Tennyson. Henry Booker Tennyson, also known as H.B. Tennyson or Duty, was a 17-year-old college freshman who played in the same band as Betty Jo Booker. The reports claim they were not friends. H.B. Tennyson also would have been around the same age as Betty Jo when she died. His friend James Freeman provided an alibi for the night of the Virgil Starks and Katie Starks attack, but as we all know, alibi statements are not infallible. Detectives found out that Tennyson was in Texarkana that night. Henry ended his life while he was still a teen in 1948, leaving an odd poem with instructions that led to obtaining his suicide note. A newspaper article from November 5th, 1948 quoted his notice saying, quote, "Why did I take my own life? You may be asking that question. Well, when you committed 2 double murders, you would too. Yes, I did kill Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin in the city park that night, and kill Mr. Starks, and tried to get Mrs. Starks." End quote. However, Tennyson's prints were taken and compared to those left at the Booker-Martin case, and did not prove to be a match. Comparisons of Henry Tennyson's gun and shell casings at the Booker-Martin investigation were also compared and proven not to be a match. Ralph B. Bowman. On April 24th, 1946, police stated they had a man in custody, a 21-year-old named Ralph B. Bowman. He stated that he did not remember what happened or what he did during the time of the Texarkana murders, but he thought he could be the Phantom Killer. He wanted to find out who he was and stated he was in some sort of waking coma and didn't, quote, wake up, end quote, until May the 3rd. He admitted he falsified statements, as he did when he lied about being older when he enrolled in the Army at the young age of 16. He also admitted that at a showing of a World War II reenactment at a theater, he fought with several people after they said the dramatization was overacted. Even if he wasn't the culprit of the Ark-La-Tex slayings, he was a volatile individual. Bowman was arrested while at a shooting gallery by police acting on a tip, his hand still wrapped around the gun he used for target practice where he had just shot several bullseyes. After being taken into custody, the ex-Army Air Force gunner told authorities that he wanted to, quote, clear it up, end quote, and also said, quote, "If I didn't kill 6 people in Texarkana, I want to settle down and be a stuntman in Hollywood. I'm happiest when I'm living in danger," end quote. German prisoner of war. There was an escaped prisoner of war who had, in the end, completely evaded capture by local officials. Law enforcement announced this man, who had seemingly disappeared into thin air, was being considered a suspect in the Phantom Killer case. He was described as having brown hair and blue eyes, being stocky, in his early 20s, and weighing about 184 pounds. It was difficult to find out much more info about this suspect, but I would assume that a German man in the States would most likely have at least some kind of an accent, and the initial victims, Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Leray, made no mention of this. But understandably, police must consider all avenues when dealing with such a prolific case. Atoka County suspects. In Atoka County, a ranting male home invader broke into a woman's house one night and accosted her, stating that he should just kill her because he'd killed several people before. Of course, this alerted local officials to the case, and they soon questioned if this could be the work of the monstrous Phantom. 20 officers and 160 residents soon joined together to search for the man, hoping they could work in tandem to bring an end to Texarkana's newfound terror. Charles A. Coleman was arrested in Paris, Texas, and thoroughly questioned, but authorities realized that it wasn't the feared murderer of Ark-La-Tex. Because of his story, the authorities surmised the suspect couldn't have been in Texarkana during the Starks attack, being that he was in Colorado, but he was noted as being in Texarkana, quote, for murders 1 and 2, end quote. The profile of the monstrous Phantom of Texarkana was described by Manuel Trazasas Gonzalez as a, quote, shrewd criminal who had left no stone unturned to conceal his identity and activities, end quote. He was described by a psychologist at the Federal Correctional Institution in Texarkana, Dr. Anthony LaPala, as being clever and cunning between the ages of 30 through 50, and the doctor believed he would continue more invasive attacks. As we can see with the Starks, that was definitely a start. It was clear that he was a sadistic man who derived immense pleasure from inflicting the fear that he saw in the faces of his victims. Every law enforcement official clearly stated the Phantom Killer of Texarkana was never apprehended, which begs the question, just where might he have ended up? And if he really was never apprehended, how many innocent lives did he send to the grave? Alright, thank you so much for tuning in to this new segment that I've done. I really hope you guys like it. I would be interested to hear your theories of who the killer of Texarkana was back in 1946. I'm actually really interested in this case. It's been a huge one for almost 80 years now, so if you have any insights that I didn't cover, drop them in the comments, and I hope you all have a spooky day.